Welcome everyone to this program in the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art's Global Religions of Africa series, sponsored by the Lilly Endowment. My name is Michael Baird, and I am an education and curatorial assistant at the museum. For those of you who are just joining our series tonight, the purpose of this initiative at the National Museum of African Art is to reevaluate the ways in which we think and talk about religion and spirituality, to bring to the forefront the lived experience of religion and the objects of spiritual value in everyday life, to centralize the voices that are often lost when religion is discussed solely through the lens of abstract theology, or when the emphasis is placed on elite individuals within religions. The National Museum of African Art has always been committed to highlighting the intellectual and artistic contributions of the African continent and its diasporas, histories that have been and continue to be systematically ignored and undervalued in museum spaces, academia, and society more broadly. Now, more so than ever, it is essential that we amplify voices that have been silenced. We come into these conversations with the understanding that there is always more to learn, and that education is a powerful tool in dispelling ignorance. Tonight, we have the immense privilege of hearing from someone who throughout her career has prioritized education, addressed misconceptions, and recorded voices that would otherwise be lost. At this time in which the platform and the mission of the museum are as important as ever, Dr. Sheila Walker will be highlighting the global Black experience and its contributions to humanity. Dr. Walker, cultural anthropologist and documentary filmmaker, has done fieldwork, lectured, and participated in intellectual and cultural events in most of Africa and the global African diaspora. She is executive director of the nonprofit organization Afro-Diaspora Inc., the goal of which is to educate the public about the global African diaspora. Her book, African Roots, American Cultures, Africa in the Creation of the Americas, has a companion documentary, Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora. Her book, Knowledge from the Inside, Afro-South Americans Speak of Their People and Their Histories, features chapters by Afro-descendants from all the Spanish-speaking countries in South America. Her most recent documentary is Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, a Global African Diaspora, which was shown at the United Nations as the 2018 Black History Month program for the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, and was sent to be shown by UN Information Centers in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and Europe. We'll conclude the presentation tonight with a brief period for questions. At any point during the talk or after, I would encourage you to enter questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen. At this point, I present to you Dr. Walker.
Greetings, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, kind of at the Smithsonian, in a funny kind of way. And as you can see, it's my own version of the Smithsonian. I am so thrilled to be a cultural anthropologist with a focus on the global African diaspora. And I plan to share with you some of the wonderful experiences I've had in learning about this diaspora in places about which you may not think when you think about the Americas, and in places about which you probably don't think when you think about the African diaspora beyond the Americas. But Africa's got several coastlines. And so everyone who left Africa voluntarily or involuntarily, there were indeed people who left voluntarily in the past 2,000 years. Everybody didn't come to the Americas, though. People went to other parts of the world beforehand. And so I'm going to give you a sense of some of the ways in which Africans and their descendants maintained a sense, various versions of a sense of African spirituality in different parts of the world. In some places, they were able to bring their own spiritual beings and to recreate ways of worshiping their own spiritual beings. The best examples in the Americas are the Yoruba and Fon, Orishas, and Vodouns, who are quite alive and well, and especially in Brazil, Brazil being, of course, the first country of the African diaspora, the second largest African country in the world after Nigeria. Brazil acknowledges that its African descendant population is over 50% by self-identification in a place that does not have the one-drop rule like we do in the United States. So I suspect that with greater consciousness, the percentages will go up in the future of people who identify with the African heritage of Brazil. So Brazil is the place because it's got the majority of the African origin phenomena in the Americas. That's where spirituality is the most widespread. Spirituality of African origin is the most widespread and the most diverse. Um, the other places are, of course, Haiti, the second independent republic in the Americas, the first free Black republic in the world, and the first government to abolish slavery. So the Orishas and the Vodouns, particularly the Vodouns, are alive and well in Haiti, and the other place where both the spiritual beings of both the Yoruba and the Fon people, the Orishas and the Vodouns, are alive and well is Cuba. There are other places, but those are the major places in the Americas. But I do want you to get a sense that it's not just the Americas also. So there is the phenomenon of the continuity of African spiritual beings, but not only. The continuity of the Yoruba and Fon spiritual systems is based partially on the fact that those two groups of people were brought to the Americas involuntarily late during the period of the importation of Africans during the period of enslavement. But they weren't the first. So once Africans came, they began immediately reconstructing their cultural lives, just as they began reconstructing their lives in all kinds of ways. They were obliged to create new cultural forms, new cultural identities, and they did so. And they did so quite successfully because given the horror of one, being captured in Africa, two, being shipped across the Atlantic Ocean as merchandise, three, being categorized no longer as human beings, but as movable property, according to the Black laws, for example. In spite of all that, these Africans created new cultural systems, created new cultural identities that are alive and well today, 500 years after those first Africans arrived enslaved. So that's a pretty amazing accomplishment, particularly under the circumstances. So I want to give you some sense of the different kinds of ways in which Africans perpetuated their spiritual beings, but also how they used the imposed spiritual systems, mainly Christianity, to their own advantage. What they did with the Christianity that was imposed upon them, how they Africanized this religious system. My first encounter with the Africanity of Christianity was in a Baptist church in Newark, New Jersey, in which, and I was 8. I'd been to Sunday school, but this was the first time I went to the adult church. And this was the kind of church when the music got hot and the minister invited the spirit to enter into the human community. It did. The spirit did enter into the human community in the bodies of women who got happy, received the spirit. And I thought this was fascinating. I thought church was supposed to be a very different kind of phenomenon, and that whatever the religious experience was, it should be something different from everyday life. Well, there it was. These ladies with hats and purses and very well dressed, started jumping up and dancing around and saying things, singing and shouting. And I was fascinated. I thought this was quite wonderful, and I wanted to know what it was about. So when I asked the adults, well, what's that? Oh, well, she received the spirit. I was a curious kid. I wanted to know, who's the spirit? Where does the spirit come from? What's the spirit's name? Why does the spirit act like that? Well, within the Christian system that they knew how to talk about, there were no satisfying answers to those questions. And so I just kept my questions and I remained curious. And it wasn't until I went to Brazil, to Bahia, much later when I was, I guess, in my 20s. And I went to an Afro-Brazilian religious ceremony. And I saw women who looked very similar to those women I knew from Newark. When the drums, now in Newark, there were no drums, but you don't need drums for rhythm. You have organs, you have pianos, you have hands, you have feet, you have breath. So women who look very similar but still had drums. When the music got hot, those women began to what was called manifesting. They manifested the presence of the Orishas. And who were the Orishas? Well, I had to learn, obviously. Spiritual beings of the Yoruba and Fon people of Nigeria and Benin in West Africa. And the Orishas had names. They had names like Shango, like Oshasi, like Ogun, like Oshun, like Ishu. And what I learned was each of these spiritual beings each of the spiritual beings represented forces of nature or human life, principles of human life, such as maternity, paternity, forces of nature like the ocean, like the wind, like iron. So elements of nature that were that explained, made the difference in human life. And it was in the context of the worship, the relationships to these spiritual beings, that these ceremonies that I had the opportunity to attend, these ceremonies were about welcoming the spiritual beings into the human community, were about communicating with the spiritual beings. And this was a two-way street. The spiritual beings brought their blessings and the humans served them. They fed them. This was a gathering of human beings, right, as well as of spiritual beings. Well, everybody had to eat, the spiritual beings and the human beings. And so each spiritual being had his or her preferred foods. Black-eyed peas, for example, for some, that was pretty familiar. And other foods, different animals, for example, guinea hens for Oshasi, for example. So this was fascinating. And I'm not claiming that what I saw in Hopewell Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey was in any way similar to what I saw in Bahia in terms of what went on in the ceremony. But there was an underlying similarity of the nature of the relationship to the spiritual being, the intimate relationship between the humans and the spiritual. And so I'm not claiming any specific African origin. I would claim that there are African peoples, Africa being the most genetically, culturally, linguistically diverse of the continents. There are similarities between Africans in certain areas. I'm not going to generalize about a continent that has about 2,000 different ethnic groups, more than any other continent, but there are regional similarities, and they just need to be acknowledged. If we don't acknowledge the Africanity of the Americas, we can't understand the Americas. There are a couple of points I want to make that are not specifically spiritual, but that are crucial for understanding the Americas, for claiming to understand anything about the Americas. First of all, the demographics. The Americas are presented as a European creation. Well, there's a problem with that. The problem is the demographics. Between 1500 and 1800, of 6.5 million people who crossed the Atlantic Ocean from Africa and Europe to the Americas, 5.5 million came from Africa, 1 million came from Europe. That means that during the first 300 years of the existence of the modern Americas, modern in the sense that once Europeans arrived and began to create new societies after, of course, the genocide of the original people due to European diseases and mistreatment. And so in this modern American system, and when I say America, I mean from Chile to Canada, the whole thing. There's no country that has not historically had and that does not have today an African descendant population. So those are really important, just basic phenomena. So Africans and African descendants were the majority of the human beings in the Americas for most of the history of the Americas. How are we going to talk about the Americas and leave out the majority of the human beings who created the foundations of all the societies of the Americas, who did the work, and who, if we learned anything about the system of slavery, we probably learned that Africans just came as bodies to do hard work that somebody else told them to do. Well, that makes no sense. One, and two, it's just not true. Europeans had a sense of which Africans had which kind of knowledge. Now, how is that obvious? Well, what did they call coastal areas? Part of West Africa was referred to as the Rice Coast. Well, that tells you something. Another part was referred to as the Gold Coast. That tells you something else. The Gold Coast, the Portuguese were trading in gold with the people, mainly Akan-speaking people, in what the Portuguese initially called a Costa da Mina, the coast of mines. The British called it the Gold Coast. Now its independent name is Ghana, for the empire of Ghana that existed from the 3rd to the 11th century. And that was based on a lively trade and culture based on gold. So Europeans knew, which Africans knew, which technologies that they needed to construct the new societies of the Americas. When the Portuguese and Spanish found, of course, used ironically, the gold of the indigenous people of the Americas, they needed someone who knew gold metallurgy, who knew how to extract that gold. And they didn't know. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone all the way to the Americas to find someone else's gold. They would have stayed in Europe if they had their own gold there. And so, who did they bring across the ocean to extract this gold? Africans they referred to as negros minas, mining Negroes. And where did they get them? Costa da Mina, the Mina coast, the coast of mines, the Gold Coast, Ghana. And in Ouro Preto, in Brazil, the locus of the Brazilian gold rush that happened a century before the California gold rush in the United States, it was said that having negros minas, mining Negroes, in gold mines brought an almost magical luck for finding gold. Magical luck? Come on. The Portuguese knew that these were the Africans who had accumulated an extensive knowledge in gold metallurgy. Agriculture. Europeans were not tropical people. The majority of the Africans who arrived in the Americas were taken to tropical areas, mainly Brazil. The majority of all Africans wound up in Brazil, about 45%. Few wound up in the United States or British North America. About 5% wound up in British North America, about 45% in Brazil. So, tropical agriculture. Africans brought their knowledge of rice, rice cultivation. We're given the impression that the original rice was Asian. Wrong. The original rice brought to the Americas was domesticated along the shoreline of the Senegambia and along the coast of the Niger River. So, with those bases, okay, let me talk a little more about the spirituality. So, I've talked about the African spiritual beings who were brought to the Americas, whose worship continues. But also, there's a wonderful example in India. You may not think about India when you think about the African diaspora, but you should. Africans were in India much earlier than they were in the Americas. And one reason is quite simple. The Atlantic Ocean is very wide. The Indian Ocean is not. Plus, I mean, there are a lot of very simplistic explanations for things that make so much sense. The monsoon winds blow across the Indian Ocean, and for part of the year they blow from east to west, and for a part of the year they blow from west to east. The original boats that plied the Indian Ocean did not have movable sails, so they had to go with the wind. And so for part of the year, they blew Africans to India, and the other part of the year, they blew them back, or they blew Indians to Africa. One of the spiritual beings I will mention is Baba Gore, who was from Abyssinia. And he is the spiritual being of people who are now referred to in India as Siddhis, but they also call themselves Habashis, which is similar to a word that Ethiopians use for themselves, similar to Abyssinia, old name for Ethiopia. And then there's, I talked about Protestantism, my first experience, but there's Catholicism, and Catholicism was so important for the continuity of African spirituality in the Americas. First of all, most of the countries in the Americas were Catholic. South America, Spanish, Portuguese, that's all Catholic. And unlike Protestantism, Catholicism had all those saints. Well, there's, in describing Yoruba religion, particularly in Brazil, a lot of emphasis is on syncretism, the kind of the pairing of Yoruba spiritual beings with Catholic saints. Well, that's a phenomenon, but it's not the only one. There are Catholic saints who were just worshipped as such, including Black Catholic saints. Catholic saints of very specific African origin. And I want to show you some images from a film that I did that's called Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, a Global African Diaspora. And I think it's useful to see, as opposed to just having me talk about these forms of spirituality. I will show you some images, they're my images, from my field work in these places. And I will continue to comment. And then following my commentaries, and you're seeing some of these images, I look forward to having a discussion about what you will have seen. So here we go. So this is the beginning of my showing you the results of my cultural experiences that have really enriched me. We will begin in the obvious place, in Bahia, in Brazil. This is where I began my field research on the African diaspora. Diaspora, let me just, in case that word that to me is now so obvious, in case it's not obvious to everybody, it's actually quite simple. Dia, like diameter, across. Spora, like the spores on a fern, the seeds on a fern, that when the fern blows in the wind, the seeds are planted. And so diaspora just means to sow, S-O-W, like to sow seeds across. So this is, I'm talking about the sowing of seeds of Africa across the world, human beings and African culture. And of course, the first African diaspora was the diaspora of all human beings, because what we know now from geneticists, paleoanthropologists, and linguists is that the first human beings evolved in Africa. So all modern human life began in Africa, and then a small group of Africans left the African continent and populated the rest of the world. Prior to that, there were no human beings in the rest of the world. So let's begin in Bahia, the city where in the world, and I think that I can say this with no doubts, where African spirituality is the most obvious. What you're seeing now is an image of the Jiquijitororo in Salvador, the capital of the state of Bahia. And this is an artificial lake in the middle of the city in which there are these huge statues, larger than life, in the water. Spirituality is the realm in which African diasporan communities have best maintained ancestral worldviews and behaviors. In Salvador, capital of Brazil's state of Bahia, African divinities, the Orishas of the Yoruba people of Nigeria and Benin in West Africa, characterize the city's cultural and spiritual life. In spiritual ceremonies and secular performances such as this one, the Orishas dance cosmic choreographies, portraying their roles in nature and human life. So that was a performance as opposed to a real life ceremony. And there are many performances based on the gestures, the dances of the Yoruba spiritual beings in Brazil. And so there you saw Ogun, who opens the way using his swords. Ogun is the Orisha of iron, of the technologies of working the land to produce food, as well as technologies of war. And his gesture is as if he were opening the way so that the other Orishas could follow him into the human community. You also saw, who did you see? You saw Oshun, who is the Orisha of fresh water. She had on yellow, and she's considered a coquettish woman, a beautiful woman. Her color's yellow. She likes gold and other nice things. She looks at herself in a mirror to admire her beauty. You also saw Omalu, who I'm sure in Brazil is very important. Omalu is the Orisha in charge of disease. of death, but also he's considered the doctor of the poor. And his gesture when he's covered because he's diseased, but his gesture is about both spreading disease and spreading health. So he's called the Lord of the Cemetery and the Doctor of the Poor. He can bring pestilence, he can take it away. And so I would imagine there's a lot of discourse going on in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti about Omulu. Oya in red. She's her area is the wind. She's the model for an emancipated woman. And Oshosi, the Orisha of the forest, he's considered a lone hunter, a very purposeful spiritual being. And it's considered that those spiritual beings are the mistresses and masters of the heads of people. And so your behavior is presumably predicated on the characteristics of the Orisha and his or her role in the I won't say mythology because it's not considered mythology. It's considered history. It's considered real. So, but I said that the Yoruba, they were not alone. There's something called Congada in Brazil. And it's important to understand that people came from Central Africa involuntarily to the Americas prior to other Africans. And so the word Congo is found throughout the Americas in different kinds of ways. In my family, my great-grandmother's name was Congo. I have cousins named Congo now in the north of the United States, but they are not involved in a spiritual phenomenon that so clearly maintains its origin. So let me take you to Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. So that I would like to clear up the misconception that African spirituality is Yoruba only. It's not. Africa is much more complex than that. Almost half of the Africans who arrived in the Americas came from the Central African region of the Kingdom of Congo, and some African diaspora communities perpetuate Congo royal pageantry. For centuries, the Congo Kingdom was respected in the Atlantic world as an African Christian kingdom. Such esteem was reflected in European artists' portrayals of Congo diplomats. Afro-Brazilians in the state of Minas Gerais portray the pageantry of the royal courts of the kings and queens of Congo. Delegations come from afar, seeking blessings from Afro-Brazilian Congo kings and queens. So if you're in the right place in Brazil at the right time, you may be able to see processions of kings and queens of Congo. And the processions are in honor of Our Lady of the Rosary, who is a Mediterranean saint. The Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary was very important in Portugal, where the first Africans were taken beginning of the 1500s. And it's important to understand that Lisbon at the beginning of the 1500s was about 15% African, and the Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary was very African. There were the Europeans, there were the mixed people, and there were the Africans in this brotherhood. And one of the things that's interesting in Brazil is the obvious ways in which Africans met other Africans, Africans who would not have met on the continent. For example, I wound up in a Mozambique kingdom in Belo Horizonte. And it was a Mozambique kingdom that just happened to have a Congo queen. And so let me take you to Nova Gamaleira. So these are the principal, officials in this Mozambique kingdom. The woman in the woman at the end is a Congo queen in a Mozambique kingdom. This is very different from that Yoruba European Catholicism, syncretism. This is what I think is the most fundamental phenomenon that happens spiritually in the Americas, which is African-African synergy. So yes, this is about a Catholic saint, but how do they worship this Catholic saint? First of all, the captain, the let's see, the man in the short skirt, is going to sing a song about Our Lady of the Rosary. And when I asked him, what language are you singing in? That's not Portuguese. He said, oh, I don't know, something like Benguela. Well, Benguela is not a language. Benguela is a place in southern Angola, and it's a place where people from Mozambique were shipped around the southern Cape of Africa and transshipped from Benguela across the Atlantic to the Americas, more to Brazil than farther north like United States. But in Brazil, the Mozambiques and the Congos met, and they are together in this African-African syncretism as evidenced in Mozambique kingdoms with Congo queens. And as you will find out, they're saints. There's Our Lady of the Rosary. She's Mediterranean, but she's never alone. She always comes with Saint Benedict the Moor from Palermo in Italy, whose parents were enslaved Ethiopian. Now, what did Ethiopian mean in those days? Mid-African. It did not mean the current geopolitical Ethiopia. And Saint Iphigenia, the oldest Afro-Catholic saint from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Angoma Didambitambaruera Kundera Kunde Possonu Anjo Sacramenta Angoma no dia de Ambi Pupeia Mussamba Awe Ei, Nossa Senhora do Rosário, quando no mar apareceu, nego velho na beira da praia ajoelhou, mas chegou no Tabu Gomá que nossa mãe se assentou. E Nossa Senhora Aparecida, Santa Rita, São Benedito, Santa Efigênia.
So, first of all, he said that Our Lady of the Rosary sat on the ngoma. That word, ngoma, is a Proto-Bantu word for drum. And so it's a word that exists throughout Southern Africa, Central and Southern Africa, and it exists in India, in that there are Afro-Indian groups, Siddhi groups, that call themselves Siddhi Goma because of that name for their drum, and that name is used in this Mozambique kingdom. In Brazil, the first saint, Aparecida, is the patron saint of Brazil. And people say, well, she's not Black because she's Black. Oh, well, she seems to be Black because she's Black. So now, India, of course. I mean, how can you leave out India? India provides a nice balance for the United States in that all Afro-Indians were not enslaved. This saint, known as Gore, was an agate merchant and went to India voluntarily, and there he became a saint because of evidencing his spiritual powers in ridding the village of Ratampur of a demoness who was tormenting people. The Indian Ocean, Afro-descendant communities also venerate spiritual beings of African origin. Baba Gore, the African saint of the Siddhis from Gujarat, comes from Abyssinia or Ethiopia in Northeast Africa. Baba Gore arrived in the village of Ratampur as an agate merchant 800 years ago. Baba Gore also had great spiritual powers, and Siddhis built a shrine in his honor. As guardians of the shrine, they share Baba Gore's blessings with fellow Siddhis and with other Indians. Baba Gore is now worshipped not only by Siddhis, but also by other Indians of various faiths. Now, I'm sure that when you think about the African diaspora, you think about Bolivia. Or maybe you don't think about Bolivia, but maybe you should think about Bolivia. So this is the same Saint Benedict, who is important in the Congadas in Brazil, in the Mozambique kingdoms in Brazil. This is Saint Benedict the Moor, the patron saint of Palermo in Sicily and southern Italy. And he is important to various groups of particularly Afro-South Americans, but also he has a presence in the United States also in African-American Catholic and Episcopal churches and schools. St. Benedict's, often a common name. So let me take you to Los Yungas is an area where Afro-Bolivians were concentrated until about 2 generations ago when they began to migrate to cities, but it's still considered the kind of the homeland of Afro-Bolivians. Because Iberian Catholics dominated the enslaving of Africans in the Americas, several Afro-descendant communities worship Black Catholic saints. Patron saint of Palermo in Sicily, Saint Benedict's parents, enslaved in Italy, were from Ethiopia.
Como somos de la diáspora africana, entonces queremos conocer también las festividades que cada pueblo o región o territorio de esta Suramérica festejan a sus santos negros.
In adopting these saints, Africans and their descendants also adapted them to an African understanding of how to celebrate them joyously. You had the opportunity to see the person who has one of my favorite names in the Americas, Juan Angola Maconde, whom when I met him said, I'm Juan Angola Maconde from Bolivia. We don't have any African culture. And I said, Angola Maconde? You made up the name? How could you have 2 African names? Angola and Maconde, an ethnic group from East Africa. 2 African names and no African culture? Well, it seems to me that their rhythmic way of celebrating a saint like Saint Benedict suggests that they've maintained their sense of how to, as the Bible says, make a joyful noise unto the Lord, come before his presence with singing, and if you're going to sing, you might as well dance. And another group I'm sure you think about when you think about the African diaspora, Afro-Paraguayans. And this is St. Balthazar of the 3 wise men, Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Balthazar the African from East Africa, the land of Punt, which would be Somalia, Ethiopia. Balthazar, also from Northeast Africa, was the African of the 3 kings who the Bible said took gifts for the birth of Jesus.
Es un santo negro, como dice ella, como nosotros, que nos identifica en realidad porque es un santo que nosotros consideramos que es un santo de los afrodescendientes. No puede ser de otro color, sino como nosotros.
In the community chapel, Balthazar carries an incense burner representing his gift of precious incense. Another segment of the Afro-Paraguayan community called Cambacua, their name coming from the Bakamba people of the Republic of Congo, celebrates a different version of the saint.
El santo negro, como ya decían, que es San Balthazar, uno de los 3 reyes magos. Hace milagros. Hay gente que si ya le pidieron y le cumplió el milagro, por ejemplo, si alguien está enfermo, le pide y le pide un milagro y le cumple una promesa que se recupere esa persona.
This Balthazar carries not an incense burner, but a drum, called by the Central African Bantu term candombe, that also designates the community's music and dance.
Le gusta todo lo que es el tambor, el baile, todo eso le gusta.
Night before Three Kings Day, January 6th, the Kambakwa begin to celebrate their African saint.
Siempre es la fiesta de los negros, el santo de los negros de canto.
The Kambakwa also organize an annual festival attended by thousands of people at which they honor their African saint. And Ecuador, of course. Now we're talking about the Pacific coast of South America. And I was amazed the first time I went to the Pacific coast of South America. I wondered what part of Africa I was in. So let me take you to the Pacific coast of South America and to a celebration for the only Black saint born in the Americas, Saint Martin de Porres. And one of his miracles, obviously he had to make miracles to be a saint, was to have three animals who are not traditionally friends, the rat, the cat, and the dog, eating out of the same plate. He also, being an African descendant, was not of the elite, hence he is represented as carrying a broom, with which his initial role before he proved his ability to make miracles was cleaning up the convent.
Bueno, San Martín con el poder de Dios, el Señor le ha dado el poder y él hace muchos milagros a nuestra raza. Porque hay muchas personas que sí de verdad les ha hecho milagros y la gente por eso cree mucho en él. Vamos a Canchimalero a buscar a San Martín para celebrar el cumpleaños de él.
Saint Martin de Porres, the only Black saint born in the Americas, is famous in his native Peru for his miraculous healing. In river communities in Esmeraldas province in Peru's neighboring Ecuador, Saint Martin also saves people from drowning. The communities organize a river procession to Canchimalero, partying their way to Saint Martin's party.
Como las balsas hacen como forma de concurso, cuál es la mejor balsa, cuál es la que mejor tiene mejor presentación. Entonces, por decir, cada parroquia se encarga de que su balsa sea bonita para que tenga buen éxito.
The usual quiet village of Canchimalero explodes when thousands of people converge to celebrate their saint.
Las personas se comprometen, ¿no? Por algo bueno que les haya hecho, por un milagro.
Yo había viajado en muchos países en África, bastante. Pero la vida, celebrar con alegría, eso es típicamente africano. Esta manera de vivir con la fiesta, con la alegría, eso es puramente africano, la danza.
So, the separation between the spiritual and the human is not so separate, just like the separation between the sacred and the profane is not so separate. And those images that you saw are from my documentary, Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, A Global African Diaspora. And I hope you've enjoyed your tour, your spiritual tour of the global African diaspora. And there's more. I have more research to do.
Thank you so much for that. I truly learned so much. We don't want to take too much of your time, but we do have a couple questions that came up while you were talking. One of the first that we have. Hi, Dr. Walker. As a history graduate student, I have read plenty of books on the African diaspora and the impact of Africans throughout the world. My question is, as an African American woman, was there any point in your travels that you felt unaccepted or out of place? Also, where can I watch your film, Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places?
Okay, did I feel out of place? Well, I knew I was from Jersey and I was in Brazil and that was different, but no one looked at me and said, oh, you must be a gringa. When I spoke my best, of course, Portuguese, that sounded funny to other people, people would say, oh, you talk funny. What part of Brazil are you from? And so as a result of my research in various places in Africa and the African diaspora, my sense of identity now is that I am from the global African diaspora with a US passport as a result of the slave ship. I really should have been Brazilian, statistically speaking. Now, one of the questions I saw also was the division of labor between males and females. And females are, and this is one of those explanations I really like, females are considered more apt for spiritual roles, for receiving the orishas. Or one way of saying it is, oh, during slavery, the women weren't busy. Give me a break. But so there are male roles, there are female roles. Males play the drums. Males are the sacrificers of animals, for example. Females are the cooks. So there's kind of a traditional division of labor, but there are roles for everybody. And one question may arise about people who don't fall into the binaries of gender. Well, that's okay. That's all explainable in the context of the Yoruba philosophy that I've encountered in Brazil. I can't speak beyond that because I didn't encounter everything every place. But everything has to make sense. It's a spiritual system that's a system of everyday life. The idea that you do religion on Sunday morning at 11, how much sense does that make? You're doing religion all the time. And so how do you represent this kind of spirituality? Well, this spiritual system is very materialized. The specific orishas, for example, have implements that represent them. Oshun has a golden mirror. Oshosi has a bow and arrow, he's a hunter. Let me see, Iemanjá, she represents the ocean. They have colors, they have foods. So all of those ways of materializing them are ways of representing their presence in the human community. And for example, foods, okay? People will eat the food of their orisha on the day of their orisha in order to ingest that kind of spiritual power. Wednesday, for example, is a day of Shango, and who's in charge of justice. And I had a friend who, if he was going to have an exam, for example, well, he would schedule his exam for Wednesday. And he would eat food of Shango on Wednesday just to make sure that he had all the the spiritual advantage that he could get. So it's it's all about everyday life, but it's about how everyday life is not separate from the spiritual. And yeah, how do you get to see the film? Well, you've got to find me. I was so busy working on the research and learning how to make the film that I haven't gotten out ready. I have not gotten to figuring out how to market it yet. So you saw my website, and you can write to me via that website, afrodiaspora.net. And you can see trailers on YouTube, Sheila S. Walker. And there's one that's kind of a long trailer. It's 5 minutes from 4 places.
Thank you so much. We have another one that just came in. Can you talk about a coming together of Yoruba fun with people of the diaspora who practiced Candomblé, Odun, Santeria some years ago?
Well, let's see. I know that there have been various gatherings. The first one about which I'm familiar was in New York in 1986. And there were people from various places in Africa, mainly people from the Americas, places as diverse as Argentina and Cuba and Brazil. And they shared, they shared how they practice, for example, the cult of the ancestors. And it's not exactly the same every place, but what is shocking is how much the same it is. Because when Africans were disembarked in different ports, they didn't get back together and say, okay, how are you going to do this? Well, this is how we're going to do it. No, but they had enough of a similar worldview that they were able to take similar elements of what they found in the Americas and maintain their worldview such that those similar elements were manipulated in ways that are still recognizable. And so now, things have gotten very complex. Initially, there were the African synergies, like the Mozambiques and the Congos who met in Brazil and Minas Gerais, for example, and then they brought in some Ethiopian saints. One of the things that I saw in that Mozambique kingdom was that some of the members of the Mozambique kingdom had on beads for the Yoruba Orishas. Well, how did that happen? Well, there's no reason not to accumulate all of the spiritual power that you can. And in the context of the Americas that are such a fascinating synergy, it's absolutely reasonable that, first of all, people whose ancestors did not come from the specific places where, say, the Orishas or the Voduns came from, that they be involved. I taught at the University of California, Berkeley. And one of the things I said in a class was, unlike Christianity, for example, Yoruba religion can't proselytize because it's ancestral. So, I belong to my ancestors. So I can't say, oh, why don't you come join us? No, you don't belong to my ancestors. Well, there was a Chinese American student in my class who said, my name is Jose Wang and I'm a son of Shango. And I thought, of course, only in Berkeley would you have this Chinese American whose religion is Yoruba and who's got a Spanish name. And wow, but what cultural richness that represents.
Thank you so much. One that just came in, what trends are you aware of or are of interest to you in recent scholarship on African diasporic spirituality?
Oh, wow. Let's see. One of the things that I find particularly interesting is the examination of ways in which these spiritualities of African origin have come together when when African diasporans of different African traditions have met in the Americas and then have met Africans. For example, I met a Yoruba man, a Yoruba from Nigeria, from Yoruba land, who came to the Americas and people said, oh, you're a Yoruba, what's your Orisha? And he said, oh, I'm Episcopalian. I'm like, come on, man, get real. And as a result of all these people saying, hey, get real, this man began to kind of get rid of his Episcopalian, outerwear, and return to the spiritual system of his ancestors. There's an interesting book, I forget its name, but it's about the Garifuna people. And they're an interesting African diasporan group, originally from St. Vincent, but deported from the island of St. Vincent to the mainland, to Roatan Island off Honduras, from which they made their way to the mainland of Honduras, Belize, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And they have maintained a spiritual system that involves elements of Africanity, elements of their indigenous American ancestry. Well, then they come to New York and they bring this spiritual system that they don't consider African, but then they meet people who do consider their spiritual systems African. And then the Garifuna are like, oh, okay, maybe it came from farther back. Maybe it's from Africa before it got to Urumé, St. Vincent. And so as a result of all of these folks coming together, the African synergy and the synergy with the indigenous and European spiritual systems has gotten much more complex, much more fascinating, and much more real. That's what the Americas are. It is, the Americas are this kind of coming together with all these different kind of trends to create something new.
Thank you so much for that. We have time for one more question. And can you speak about the role of museums in furthering greater empathy and understanding during these difficult times, and how Africa's global religions might also speak to this difficult contemporary moment?
Well, one of the things that these African spiritual systems represent is how African worldviews allowed people to say, yeah, okay, that is good too. We are going to expand our worldview to include yours. And we are going to be enriched by having included yours. For example, I was at the Feast of Good Death in the town of Cachoeira. And the Feast of Good Death is Catholic, except that the women who participate in it are all priestesses of the Yoruba Orishas. and I was asking one of these priestesses about the Yoruba connection, and she tried to tell me, no, we're being Catholic right now. As I was leaving, she said, may Omolu bless you. Okay, so, and one of the things that's happened within the last 20 years or so is that, yes, the Catholic saints were used as kind of camouflage to be able to maintain the Orishas, to camouflage them. But with greater freedom, that is no longer so necessary. And so I asked one of these members of the Sisterhood of Good Death, the Catholic phenomenon, well, if you can worship the Orishas overtly, why do you need the Catholic saints? They make miracles. Well, what about the Orishas? They make miracles. Anthropologists can ask those kind of dumb questions. But if you have several sources of miracles, why do you want fewer? And one of the things that I was very clear about in Brazil was, whereas spiritual systems in the United States tend to be either or, I guess maybe that's the nature of Protestantism, right? It's either this or that. There's this whole idea of the polarity of there's God who's in charge of good and the devil who's in charge of evil. I don't think most of the people in the world have that kind of simple binary worldview. And so what I was very struck by in Brazil was that it's not either or, it's both and. I met a woman who at a candomblé ceremony who said, I'm a daughter of Oya and I'm Jewish. Well, why not? Why not accumulate identities? I mean, that's much richer than saying, well, I'm only this. Oh, come on. Why would you want to be only this when you can be this and that? And so that means that in the context of a candomblé ceremony, there's dancing, there's music. That's pretty exciting and pretty enriching. So I think the message is that inclusiveness is much more interesting than exclusiveness. And why can't you navigate between identities? Yeah, right now we're doing our Catholic thing. Oh, you want something else? We'll come tomorrow and we'll be doing that.
That's wonderful. That's all the time that we have tonight, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Dr. Walker, for your time and for this wonderful talk. And thank you to everyone who was able to tune in tonight. Truly, the platform and mission of this museum is as important as ever. So thank you, Dr. Walker, for highlighting these overlooked stories and amplifying the voices of those who are all too often underrepresented. Education is always an essential first step towards empathy and understanding. Be sure to check out our social media at NMAFA on Twitter and Instagram, and at si.africanart on Facebook for updated schedules and links to upcoming activities. Everyone stay safe and well. Thank you so much.